Good afternoon. This is Misty Black Bear with Adult Services and Aging, the Adult Services and Aging Waiver Manager. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for participating in today's webinar. This is the third in a series of webinars regarding the Home and Community-Based Services Settings Final Rule. Today we will be reviewing work and volunteer, community access and activities, as well as the assisted living addendum to the South Dakota Medicaid Provider Agreement. I do want to say just again up front that we, like I've mentioned before, have submitted to CMS our statewide transition plan. We have not received initial approval regarding the statewide transition plan to date. So just kind of a little caveat up front that potentially some of the information presented to you here today is subject to change or potentially additions to the action steps. However, at this time we are confident in moving forward that we will get approval and hope that there won't be any significant changes regarding the information we present here today. So the first thing we'll be discussing here today is work and volunteer. So everything we're going to talk about today, or the first two topics anyway, are within the community integration concept area of the HCBS Settings Final Rule and HCBS Settings Expectation Guide. So regarding work and volunteer, in general, consumers are able to work and volunteer in the community as they choose. So the community integration expectations for work and volunteering can be found on page 34 of the HCBS Settings Guide, so you can follow along there if you would like to. The information discussed here is really mostly taken from there. So this is the information you'll actually find in the statewide transition plan. You'll see the expectation there again that providers arrange supports for an individual to work or volunteer in an integrated setting when an individual is interested in working or volunteering. So as far as the compliance action steps there, the first one is to educate providers of state and federal expectations. And that's really the purpose of this webinar series, is really to complete that action step. That is the initial action step for really all of the areas within the statewide transition plan. And so today we'll be providing the information on these two areas. On the other action step you'll see there is for DSS to change the ASA waiver eligibility requirements for earned income. And so as you all are probably aware and remember that we did get our ASA, Adult Services and Aging, did get our waiver approved on November 21st. The effective date of that waiver was backdated to October 1st, 2016. And so one of the updates that we made was the earned income allowance for a consumer residing in an assisted living was increased to 75. Now previously that was actually 0. And so what this means is that consumers who reside in assisted living and who are working will benefit because they will be able to keep up to $75 in earned income from their job in addition to their typical $60 maintenance needs allowance. And so we believe that this really removed the disincentive for consumers residing in an assisted living to work. Previously, they didn't get to keep any money that they had earned through a job. And so we wanted them to at least be able to have some incentive to working if they chose to do so. So the work and volunteer policy expectations, which again can be located on page 34 of the expectations guide. The provider will offer alternative meals or activities of daily living arrangements for consumers choosing to work or volunteer. So what this means, if someone wants to work or volunteer, if they're doing so during meal times, or if they want to participate in activities of daily, or if they need assistance with activities of daily living, that these things would need to be rescheduled. They would need to be able to get a meal when they return back from the work or volunteer site. And they would also be able to receive that assistance with their daily living arrangements if they do need that. So second policy expectation is that the provider will arrange transportation or natural supports for consumers wishing to work or volunteer. So I want to enforce here that providers are not required to be the sole source of transportation. However, the expectation is that if a consumer residing in the assisted living does want to work or volunteer, that you would assist that person in arranging transportation, either family, friends, maybe there's another person in the same setting that also works or volunteers at the same place, and just really assisting with setting up natural supports or other transportation in order for individuals to be able to work and volunteer in their communities. The provider should also facilitate access to materials, advertising opportunities to work or volunteer. You know, this might be a newspaper, there could be posters hanging, maybe access to a job site, any of those types of things, but just making sure that if someone is interested in working and volunteering, that they are getting the materials and information and resources necessary to be able to go forward with that. A consumer may participate in meaningful non-work activities in an integrated setting for the period of time he or she desires. And so this is something that, you know, if a consumer wants to work or volunteer for 30 minutes or for 8 hours, it really is up to them and their preferences and their needs as to how much or how little they would be working or volunteering in the community. Any modifications or restrictions must be documented in the ASA Person-Centered Care Plan. And as we've been participating in the previous webinars, we have noted that basically any modifications or restrictions that are implemented due to the health and safety concerns of an individual, and again, that's really the only time that modifications or restrictions can be in place. But if those do occur for whatever reason, it would put the person's health and safety at risk if they were to work and volunteer, then those would need to be documented in a specific way in the Person-Centered Care Plan. And as I had indicated at our last webinar, last couple webinars, we are working through really the details of this process and protocol by which the assisted living settings will communicate back and forth with the ASA specialist to ensure that it is documented. And so we do hope to provide some more training on that in the near future. Hopefully before the webinar series ends, we will be having discussion regarding that. Okay, so the next section or action step or really topic area within the community integration concept area is community access and activities. So this can be found on page 33 of the expectations guide. The whole actually community integration concept area can be found on page 33 and then into page 34. So in general, the provider offers activities in the setting and also takes steps to educate consumers about activities in the broader community, and also encourages and facilitates consumers' access to these activities consistent with consumer preferences and needs. So what you'll see here then is the expectation. Again, this is from the statewide transition plan, but then there's some compliance action steps which were again listed in the statewide transition plan there as well. And of course the first is to educate providers of state and federal expectations, which again is the reason for the webinars here today and the series that we have been implementing over the past several weeks. You'll see the basic compliance action steps listed there. And then providers must support consumer access to the community effective immediately and will be reviewed for compliance by DSS in December of 2017. At that time, like I said, we will be reviewing to ensure compliance, but in the meantime, probably closer to the summer or fall, DSS will evaluate the level of access for consumers and may potentially identify additional action steps necessary to be fully compliant by March of 2019. So we would expect that you begin to comply with this and ensure that people are accessing activities in the community as well as the community itself. We will be reviewing this likely around December of 2017, but we could potentially be coming up with some additional action steps if we do not feel like there's full compliance among settings. And so this we will just have some additional updates in the near future. So as far as community access and activities and the policy expectations, the provider will promote participation in outside activities but is not required to fund participation in the outside activities. Some of this is going to be very familiar than what we just reviewed with the work and volunteer information. Secondly, the provider will arrange or provide non-medical transportation to the community, including natural supports. So again, potentially, we aren't expecting you to be the sole source of transportation, but would expect you to assist the consumer if necessary in arranging non-medical transportation, which might include utilizing some natural supports if available. Again, like before, the provider will offer alternative meals or activities of daily living arrangements for consumers choosing to participate in outside activities and events. So again, if someone decides that they want to go and participate in an activity at the YMCA, that goes typically over the lunch hour that is typical in the assisted living, it would be expected that you then are providing an alternative meal to that individual when they return. The provider will offer activities in the assisted living center. So again, that is part of the actual social activities are actually part of the assisted living service itself. But again, if a person prefers to participate in outside activities and access the community, then that is something that should be able to be realized by that person. And again, any modifications or restrictions due to health and safety concerns will be documented in the ASA Person-Centered Care Plan, which we are working through the protocol regarding the communication between the assisted living and the ASA specialist for that process, and we'll provide additional information in the near future. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about today, not along the lines of the community integration concept area, but just kind of a reminder regarding the assisted living addendum to the South Dakota Medicaid Provider Agreement. I just wanted to talk briefly about this. If you've participated in previous webinars, you've heard this already. But I do just want to reiterate that we have sent these out to all Medicaid enrolled assisted living providers. And so you should have those by now. It's been probably a week and a half, 2 weeks since we sent them out, and we have begun to receive them back. So providers that received those were pulled from an active list of Medicaid enrolled assisted living providers. And so if you believe that you got this unintentionally, I don't think that's probably the case, but rather what should occur if you do not intend to provide assisted living services, Medicaid assisted living services, please contact me if you've received one of these and you don't intend to be a Medicaid provider, because you will continue to receive the communications and will continue to request information and expect to see the provider addendum from all Medicaid enrolled providers. And so if you don't intend to provide the service under Medicaid, then we would want to make sure that you get that taken care of with Medicaid enrollment. So the assisted living addendum does serve as an addendum to the South Dakota Medicaid Provider Agreement for assisted living providers and does allow assisted living providers to participate in providing home and community-based services. So the reason that Adult Services and Aging is implementing the assisted living addendum to the South Dakota Medicaid Provider Agreement, within the HCBS settings final rule, CMS required that states specify how they will ensure continuous compliance with the action steps in the statewide transition plan. So the Department of Social Services chose a two-step continuous compliance process, and the first part of that process is for providers to attest to compliance with the final rule and an assisted living addendum to the South Dakota Medicaid Provider Agreement. And so this will ensure that providers agree to the expectations and the expectations guide, which is some of the language within this addendum. Additionally, in order to ensure ongoing compliance, DSS will incorporate the provisions of the HCBS settings final rule into an annual review process. And so, again, also hopefully in the near future, we will be releasing or coming up with an actual kind of schedule by which we will be completing the reviews for all of the things we've been discussing over the past few weeks. So more to come on that, but just do know that we will plan to implement an annual review process. We will be potentially coming on site to ensure that you are in compliance with the HCBS settings final rule and working with you to resolve any issues if you are not. So again, all providers do sign a provider agreement when they enroll for South Dakota Medicaid, and so some people have kind of questioned have questions. Let's see, I think I went into the next one. So yeah, some people have questioned where their provider agreement or contract is and what is this really an addendum to. So when you initially enrolled in South Dakota Medicaid, you signed a provider agreement. And so if your agency, organization, setting, whatever is requesting that you get a copy of that contract, you would need to contact Medicaid enrollment in order to get that, because they have the original agreement on file. The provider agreement which you signed does contain general Medicaid rules that apply to every provider. Some providers provide special services that are subject to additional federal or state requirements, and these providers are required to sign an additional agreement with the department stating their agreement to these additional provisions. And so that's really the purpose again of the South Dakota Assisted Living Addendum to the South Dakota Medicaid Provider Agreement. Again, this document really outlines additional requirements for assisted living providers, like I just said, and it formalizes really for the most part what assisted living providers already do. So a lot of this is not new, stuff that's been reiterated before, or maybe there wasn't a formalized process and this just formalizes that process. And like I said, the addendum has been sent out to all Medicaid assisted living providers, and we would really appreciate you signing and returning that by January 15th of 2017, which actually would be, I believe, this Sunday. And so just trying to get it in the next week, if at all possible, would be great. So what the Assisted Living Addendum to the South Dakota Medicaid Provider Agreement really contains, for the most part, one of the sections is the purpose of the assisted living service itself. There's also standard program definitions and requirements. There is a statement regarding the need for providers to comply with administrative rules of South Dakota, as well as the need or agreement for providers to comply with all licensing requirements and other standards required by federal, state, county, city, or tribal statutes, regulation, or ordinance in which the service and or care is provided. So again, this isn't really meant to take the place of, it doesn't take away any of those other regulations. It's really an addendum or a supplement to those regulations. As I mentioned before, I guess it's on here twice, but there are standard definitions and program requirements within the addendum. And then the two areas that are most applicable to the HCBS Settings Final Rule itself are the compliance with the HCBS Statewide Transition Plan and Action Steps, as well as compliance with the HCBS Settings Final Rule itself. So you will see additional information on that. So that actually concludes today's webinar, and this, like I said, I believe is the third in the series of provider educational webinars. The next webinar is coming up on January 25th, 2017. Will again be held at 1:30 until 3 if it takes that much time. So during that particular webinar, we will be just doing an overall review of the HCBS Settings Guide to Expectation and Compliance. And we'll be doing an overview of the areas, topics, and concept areas that we have not already reviewed in the previous webinars. And then there will also be another kind of final webinar. I think it, I can't remember the exact date, but it's around mid-February. And during that time, we will be basically just giving providers the opportunity to ask questions. We may also potentially add another topic if that is necessary, if we find that necessary. And so be looking for that information. But as usual, I will email out the links shortly before the webinars are to be held so that you can have the information and are hopefully able to log on. If you do have any questions, please feel free to give me a call or to email me at the DSS HCBS email, which is where you are receiving all the current notifications, or you can also feel free to email me at my state email address. Thank you again for joining us today. We do look forward to the next webinar in a couple weeks.